Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of UXR Conversations, my YouTube video cast where I speak to researchers and research leaders, and today authors in addition to all that. And we chat about a bunch of research-related things and whatever we really want to. This is a very special episode to me, and I'm so excited to have a unique guest. I believe, Will, you're the first economist I'm speaking to, the first book author I'm speaking to on the podcast, and many more things. So a huge welcome to you, Will. Thank you so much for doing this. How are things?
Great, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Feeling good about this interview and loving your work.
Thank you so much. So for those of you who don't know me, and this is your first time on this YouTube channel, I'm Noam Siegel. I'm Director of User Research at Wealthfront. And today we are joined by Will Page, who was the former Chief Economist at Spotify, and these days is the author of the forthcoming book, Tarzan Economics, which we will be talking quite a bit about. And just want to introduce Will in a little more detail and kind of talk a bit about what you've been up to. So you were the chief economist at Spotify and PRS Music, where you pioneered something called Rockonomics. Is that how you say it? Rockonomics?
That is the right description, yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about what that is. At PRS, you've published work on Radiohead's In Rainbows and saving BBC Six music. At Spotify, you helped redefine catalog and articulate the global value of music copyright. All sounds fascinating. And in your book, your first book, congratulations on that, Tarzan Economics, 8 Principles in Pivoting Through Disruption, you're talking about some really interesting ideas, including measurement and what we should and should not measure, which we will get into, this notion of rockonomics, pivotal thinking, and so many more things, which I hope we have time to get into. And in addition to all this, you are also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. Amazing. So again, welcome, Will, and thank you so much for chatting with me. And to those of you watching this, if you have any questions or comments about anything we're going to talk about today, please add them in YouTube, and we will try and take a couple of questions as we go. Will, shall we start with what brought us together?
Let's go for the bingo.
So my perspective is that I spent a weekend making a website called NPS is the Worst. You can find it at npsistheworst.com. That's the URL. By the way, Will, I'm also the owner of npsisthebest.com, and if you click on it, it takes you to npsistheworst.com, just so you know.
Clever.
Yeah, I know.
That's a counter-strike right there.
Exactly.
You're game theorist. Clearly, you're applying some game theory.
So I make this website, NPS is the Worst, and it has resources about why NPS is not, let's put it lightly, the best metric of anything, really. And it includes other resources. There's a swag shop. You can buy anti-NPS merchandise, and there are also...
You can't buy NPS toilet paper yet, I don't think. Can you?
I can see if that's an option. And then I got a bunch of messages, but yours was by far the most interesting to me, because I couldn't believe that you messaged me about this, and you shared that I think a colleague of yours or a friend of yours sent you the website and you found it, and that you had some stuff about NPS in this new book that you're publishing. So tell me, what's your perspective on this, and what's your thinking on NPS, and how is it put in the book? Like, what section of the book is this in that you talk about it?
Absolutely. So the chapter that this crops up in is called Big Data, Big Mistakes. And the point I make there is, there's, I think, 8,000 books on Amazon with the word big data in its title, all, proclaiming the strength of big data, the achievements of big data, where we can go with big data. I don't think there's enough to counterbalance that to say, where can you make a big mistake by trusting big data? Yeah, my job at Spotify and prior at PRS Music was often challenging what big data was telling us. What's not on that dashboard? What matters most is often what we measure least. And that was a big thing for me throughout my career. And then in that chapter, I'm working through various examples where big data is going wrong. A really interesting example of an article that The Economist published where he said AI can write articles just like a journalist can. And there was like 75 tweets celebrating this article showing how AI can do the job of a journalist, to every one tweet pointing out the correction that the AI was fed guidance before writing the article. So a very interesting example of big data where you have a 75-to-1 ratio of let's believe in the hype versus let's read in the correction. So I'm building my way through this chapter to get to the section on the NPS. Now, is NPS an example of big data? Let's pause there for a second. I argue what big data means is it's big enough to make a big mistake. Some people say big data relates to the size of the company, like Big Pharma. Other people refer to it being too big to sit on an Excel spreadsheet. I understand that. But the way I steer my chapter is if data can cause mistakes, then big data can cause big mistakes. And if everybody is using this type of data, then it's really big. Therefore, there is a risk of a really big mistake. And I just want to preface this point here by saying it is just one number, the NPS score. I mean, that's how it was written back in 2004. One number that you need to trust. That's not big data, but it is a really big data pool that all these companies are using. And I think it makes a big mistake. Where did I get to in the article? Was the article by a mutual friend of ours, Jared Spool, and his famous essay from 2017. So I stress in the chapter that I've been chewing people's ears off for years about my problems with NPS. And that's a lot of ear chewing, which is a big problem if you wear glasses, because where are they going to hang? But still, when I stumbled on this Jared article from 2007, what user researchers, UX professionals can do about this score, it's just like, wow, somebody else is singing from the same hymn sheet and doing a lot better job singing than I could. So I just explore it, and I'll just hop, skip, and jump over some of the key points, and you can decide where we want to dive into. But the first point is just how it exaggerates the results. How, let's say, if we go back to Jared's famous example, you could have a turnaround professional coming into a department that's getting a negative score, all zeros, and he takes all those zeros and moves them to all sixes. Incredible achievement from scoring 0 to 6, and doesn't get any indication of improvement through the score.
Still detractors.
Still detractors. Then they leave the company because they're not getting any reward for their achievements. Someone else comes in and coattails off all that progress and moves it from 6 to 9. Boom, you've hit 5 numbers in a bonus ball. You're going to get promotion, extra resources, and everything else. And I've seen this happen so many times of just why the scoring system is, doesn't capture progress correctly. That was one of Jared's points. One of the points I want to add very quickly on the back of that is where NPS, I think, really breaks down is because it's so pervasive, because it's so ubiquitous, because we all know how the scoring works, it declares itself void. NPS only works if the people filling out the survey don't know how you've altered the scoring. So let's say I think you're a 7. Your podcast, your YouTube channel, it's a 7. It's good, it could be better, but it's a 7. But I like you, I have an affinity with you. I don't want to sit there in the neutral camp. I'm going to score you a 9 because I know the scoring. And I think that is a really big issue with this one number that we're all supposed to trust. Because it's the one number that we all know how it works behind the scenes, we can no longer trust it. And there's others too, like survey responses. Those who are dissatisfied with this NPS survey are least likely to complete it. So you have a bias there. And maybe just wrap up on this final point, and I'll toss it back to you. What are you not asking if the NPS culture says you only need to ask this one question? And the example I use in my book is telcos. I'm a Vodafone subscriber, have been for many years. They hit me with NPS surveys every time I come off the phone. They never ask me, this is Vodafone, my antiquated telco operator, they never ask me, have I recommended WhatsApp to a friend? Have they asked you?
Yeah. No.
Remind me, what's that one number we all need to know again?
Yeah. I'll say this, and then we can move on to what actually does matter and what should we be measuring, because I believe that part of your book is about that idea, especially in the context of governments and what they should be measuring. But I will say one thing. It is so easy, especially these days, to deploy research, to send out a survey, to conduct a diary study. Do you remember when diary studies used to be, you would literally send like a real physical diary to people, and they would fill it out and they would mail it back to you? And that wasn't so long ago. Deploying surveys, deploying questions like NPS, it is so cheap and so easy. And so dangerous, It's too easy. It's too simple. And I love that framing of yours around big data, not just being about the size, not just being about, does it fit in 65,000 lines of an Excel spreadsheet, or does it take up more space than that? It also matters what the potential impact can be. And research not done with some amount of rigor can have very, detrimental, poor, dangerous consequences. And I think we just have to respect that more and quit it with the kind of big, well-marketed, easy measures that end up being just completely useless. I'm happy we're starting to change things around.
Well, I want to stress live on your channel that any wind I can put into the sail of your wonderful website and the alternative URL that you've hijacked, let it be. But maybe just two quick comments there as well. One, I just think as a management tool, Matt LeMay and Tricia Wang at Sudden Compass Research, two wonderful people that you should definitely eye up to having on your channel. They just told me that when you look at NPS, it's another 3-letter acronym which explains what NPS is really about. It's like, what other 3-letter acronym could it be? We're in alphabet soup territory here. And they said it's CYA. It's like, sorry, British, not American. What's CYA? And they said it's cover your ass. And when you start to look at NPS through the lens of how can I cover my ass as a leader? How can I cover my ass as a flawed manager? Maybe you'll see NPS, differently. So I would encourage that as a way of looking at your fantastic work on your website. And then one last thing, just on mathematical application in a different setting, which I talk about in the book, is if you look at how macroeconomics works, how investment banks work, they're junkies for data points they can talk about. Why? Because they have to publish monthly research notes. Not that there's anything to talk about. We're optimizing here for monthly research notes. It's like 24-hour news. I don't care whether news is relevant. Just give me news that I can fill this glut of supply that I've got. So you have something called a PMI index, which measures net change in manufacturing orders. Again, this is a survey. It's based off recall. You have sample size errors, all that stuff. And you speak to far better experts than me to delve into those types of issues. But if you look at the mathematics of it, what we're doing is we're ignoring those who say no change. We're measuring the difference between those who say up and those who say down. So we asked Noam's factory, how are orders last month? And we asked 99 other companies like Noam's factory, how are orders last month? And the results come in. 95 people of those 100 say no change. 3 say up and 2 say down. So 3 minus 2 is plus 1. Hey, we have an expansion in the economy. Buy up the stock market. We're ready to go. You've based that result on a survey where 97 people disagree with the outcome. That's a very similar problem to the NPS issue. So, NPS is the worst, may have to expand into PMI is the worst as well. You should go to GoDaddy and buy that URL now. But you see the same problem in other areas of life, which is one simple number itself becomes big data, which itself risks a big mistake. So I see it with the PMI index. 95 no change, 3 up, 2 down, 97 people disagree with the outcome that we're actually expanding the economy. And we are doing that right now.
Yeah, I'm starting to think I maybe should expand and just buy some more kind of higher level domain, like metrics we should stop using.com or something. Because if I keep going down this route, who knows where it'll end. But let me ask you.
Coveryourass.com, that could be a good one too.
Oh, absolutely. I'm guessing that one's taken or very expensive. But But I do want to ask you, I believe that in your book, which is again Tarzan Economics, and I encourage everyone to go and pre-order it. It's coming out very, very soon in April. You talk about lessons for governments worldwide, and that what matters most is measured least. So we've talked about things that don't matter that are measured, but I'm curious to hear from your perspective, well, what does matter most, and why aren't we measuring it, and how should we measure it? I'd love to hear that.
Let's take Wikipedia for a second. So if we look at Wikipedia, that is the sum of all the world's knowledge. It does no environmental damage, and it adds 0 to gross domestic product. Now, you can think of lots of things which are not the sum of all the world's knowledge, do terrible environmental damage, and add lots to gross domestic product, are great for the economy because they drive up GDP. So we come back to this axiom of what matters most is what's measured least. And if I paraphrase Robert Solow, I'm fast concluding that the digital economy is everywhere except in government statistics. And it really is a case of when you lift the lid and you look under the bonnet of government stats, it's worrying just how much is not being captured in what matters to us. I mean, when we toss it back to you and say, Zoom's obviously had a huge part in your life over the past 14, 15 months. Where's Zoom in gross domestic product? Is it even in there?
No idea.
So this is the situation that you have here, which is, GDP was great for tangible things, for no one is on a car manufacturing plant and no one produces cars and we can measure those cars going out the door. It's not very good for intangible things. And when we're dealing with intellectual property, when we're dealing with the value of ideas, a lot of those things are getting lost. One of the most pertinent examples, and I know that a lot of your viewers are based in the States, was watching Hal Varian, a mentor to me and the chief economist at Google, giving a lecture to the British Bank of England, where he made the point that the GVA, the gross value added of the smartphone in America, a device that's changed the lives of 250 million people in the United States, is essentially 0 because you apply it to Taiwan and Korea, because that's where the R&D side, but that's where the UX professional side, that business has to get allocated through accountancy rules. And you're scratching your head thinking, well, what am I actually trying to measure here? And it's baffling. So I'll wind up this point with just making a very interesting observation. It's interesting to notice that in the United States, the value of the ideas in our heads are now worth more than the roofs above them. And what I mean by that is, since the credit crunch, we've seen the value of intellectual property in gross domestic product exceed the value of residential real estate for the first time ever. And the gap is beginning to widen. That's interesting to see in government stats. But then I encourage you and your viewers to say, okay, well, how are we measuring these ideas? How are we trying to capture the intangible economy? Where do these things exist? Where do these free goods that we don't pay for turn up in a measure of the economy which involves us paying for stuff?
Fascinating. I believe California, where I live, is the 5th largest economy in the world, but I imagine that's based on GDP or some other metric, which is not capturing the fact that California is also, and Silicon Valley in particular, where I live, is kind of the technological epicenter of the world for the time being, at least. And that's probably not really captured in any of these metrics, right?
It's not. There will be a problem of A, is it being captured but captured correctly? B, is it being captured but classified incorrectly? Or C, is it just off the radar completely? And again, in a tangible economy, in a predictable economy, you will be collecting data from trusted sources where you can measure marginal change over time. But if I think about here in the UK, the labour force survey has a sample size of, I think, about 40, 50,000 and a response rate of 60%. I asked HR departments at Google, Apple, Facebook, Spotify in London, and none of them knew what this survey was. Now, it doesn't mean they're necessarily being captured, but they could clearly be captured a lot better. Now, going back to where does tech sit in this, let me give you a kind of an example of somebody who fears what technological progress is doing. Sometimes you hear this being tossed out, which is tech is destroying more jobs than it's creating. Okay, that's a valid concern to have, and you have to respect that concern. But then you look at the shortcomings in how we measure tech, how we could measure an engineer who might move from Britain to America, work for 2 years under a visa, change the world with a piece of code, then move back to Britain again. Where is that person in the labour force survey? Just as a simple example, you have to ask yourself, is this idea that tech is destroying more jobs than it creates a function of the statistics? That it's very easy to measure the jobs that are being destroyed. No one used to work on a car plant firm's gone bankrupt, no one no longer has a job. But it's very hard to measure the jobs that tech are creating. And you have this imbalance here in how you measure the state we're in, how you judge the state we're in, which is the name of the chapter that I've given this, which creates that fear. So if we could measure all these tech jobs, we'd see far more job creation. And we weren't so biased to measuring job destruction in the areas that are easy to measure, we wouldn't have this concern.
Fascinating. So we've talked about what we shouldn't measure and a little bit about what we should. I want to take a step back now, though, and talk about even just the name of your book. Why the title Tarzan Economics? What does that mean? Where did it come from?
So it comes from a technologist called Jim Griffin, a wonderful public speaker, a really gifted public speaker, and a person who's always filled me with wisdom, with vision, with ability to sharpen my knife when it comes to developing opinions and arguments. And I met him in a Norwegian bar in 2007 to learn about his history. A bit quick factoid, he was responsible for selling the first ever musical track online, which was Aerosmith in 1995. So as a technologist, he was there on the front line of disruption before anyone else. So
which song by Aerosmith?
Oh, now I'm stuck. And I'm an Aerosmith fan as well. It will come to me before the end of this call. It's just on the tip of my tongue. Does it Save Me? But yeah, so he was at Geffen Records at the time, and he had the idea of why don't we use dial-up internet as a way of distributing a digital track. Talking quite a lot there about how the internet was being disrupted and fragmented to the border of the network as opposed to the center. We can get into that in due course. But yes, I met Jim Griffin. I finally got to meet this famous fellow in 2007. And I blame Norwegian bar prices because despite enjoying a drink with him, it's so extortionate. I managed to stay sober enough to remember this term Tarzan Economics the next morning. And I wrote it down, like this expression that he had. And it goes like this. In Tarzan Economics, we cling onto the old vine of how we do business because it holds us off the jungle floor and it pays the bills. And we're reluctant to reach out to this new vine through a fear of the unknown. So the challenge that we've got is how do we let go and how do we hold on? It's a challenge of when. Now, if you think about music as a 20-year disruption journey, and the reason why it matters is because music got there first. We woke up to Napster in June 1999. We spent the next 10 years clinging onto the old vine of CDs and downloads, hoping that was going to hold us off the jungle floor. At the same time, piracy was just, like a rising tide around our feet of digital disruption. And then in the second 10 years, we worked out how to let go and reach out to the new vine, and then adopted streaming and have never looked back since. And because we've had that 20-year head start on everyone else, what really prompted the book was, how can this help other divisions? How can this help other disciplines? How can this help other professions? It's not a book about egotistical bragging rights of used to work at Spotify or isn't music a sexy business to be in. It's my passion is teaching economics. That's what I live for. And my father taught me a great lesson when I was very young, where he said, your challenge when you're teaching economics is to focus on an audience who A, doesn't think they're going to understand it, B, doesn't want to understand it, but C, has to. And I've written the book for them. So when I started the book, the world was normal. And then along came COVID. And John Thornhill at the Financial Times called me up and said, your book's got added relevance now. I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, due to COVID, we're all staring at our Napster moment. It's accelerated change. It's accelerated the pace of disruption. So, the book has gone through its own journey to see the light of day. Publication date is less than 2 weeks away. It's April Fool's Day in the UK. It gets published the same day that Boris Johnson said lockdown would be over. Make of that what you will. And I really think that the audience for this book is literally everyone, every individual, organization, institution, staring at accelerated change, staring at their own Napster moment, and worried about how they're going to let go of the old vine and reach out to the new.
Do you have any thesis on who should next, if that makes sense? You mentioned that this notion could be applied to any industry.
Yeah,
and especially
So it's I run out of fingers on my hands when I think of the professions I could apply it to, but I'll give you a couple to move us into where I think your audience could definitely see some interesting developments career option wise. I think when you say the term digital lawyers, it's interesting. And I cover this in the introduction to the book. The best way to think about what's happening to the legal department is not to get hysterical and say the prospect of law without lawyers. I mean, I think that is on the horizon, but to look at an org chart and particularly look at the legal department within an org chart. And sometimes, quite often actually, you see the words assistant of assistant. Nowhere else in a company structure do you see the terms assistant to an assistant. Now, when you see that, and you know more than anyone know how tech works, when you see assistant to assistant in a legal department, that's fat that technology can trim. And when you look at what's happening in the digital legal space right now, it's coming fast. I know of companies where you're based in Silicon Valley. I know one which signed its first AI contract in February and is planning to keep doing so. And I also know another company with a very famous founder who's planning to scale up without a legal department. He's just going to adopt every illegal solution he can find to get there without having to employ lawyers. This does not mean lawyers are redundant and are going to be burnt on the stake. Nothing to do with that. This is about, can technology do some of the core functions that humans used to do in the legal profession? So I think that's a big one. And if I can just toss a second one in there and I'll hand it back to you as well. I think the other obvious one here is to think about journalists. Newspapers for the past 20 years have, for me, been behaving like ostriches, failing to ignore the winds of disruption that's been blowing at them. It's not working out. I mean, every year that passes, like the boy who cries wolf, hey, we've managed to build a subscription model. Well, how many subscribers do you actually have? Music has over 400 million subscribers now. Some of our best broadsheet titles haven't got 1 million yet. So it's a drop in the ocean of where they need to be. And I look at the problems facing the newspaper industry, and I start with a great one for the UX experts watching, which is, why do you even call it a newspaper? Why? For most people, it's a piece of glass. We don't hold paper anymore. It smudges our hands and leaves ink on our fingers. We don't like doing that anymore. We touch pieces of glass. So what is the actual business you're in? But as solutions, and I think for UX experts here, you look at what Axios is doing, an Israeli US-based tech company, and you look at what The Athletic is doing in sports journalism, where you're seeing a collective model appear. So we specialize in sports journalism. We hire the best sports journalists. We pay them comp, which is above their base rate. We give them equity in the startup, which is very interesting for a journalist to actually have an incentive in the entity they're writing for. And they're getting a user experience there, which is more pleasant than trying to find the sports pages on the newspaper website, where all I can see is annoying adverts for stuff I'm not interested in because they've palmed it off to third-party ad inventory companies. The user experience on newspapers today is terrible, and companies like Athletic and Axios are coming in hard with much more, how would you say, preferable solutions, I think.
So on this point of changes in journalism, let me ask you as an economist, and maybe us non-economists use the word economy a little bit too loosely. But I would say I'm part of what we're now calling the creator economy.
Yeah.
Where we have many journalists who have now got their own publication. They might have a newsletter or some other thing going on. We have podcasts and so many new forms of journalism, and more broadly, just content creation. And I'm wondering what you think about the creator economy and how that fits in with the evolution, or maybe lack thereof, of journalism.
It's huge. We could take this conversation in various different directions. Substack would be an obvious one in terms of the amazing work they're doing. Medium, I think we should name check as well, because they're looking at monetization models. Interestingly, very similar debates that we're having in music just now, which is how should we pay? Words per page or time spent reading? These types of discussions coming through. But I'll break it down into a couple of areas here. I think one, what fascinates me is the rebirth of the newsletter. Didn't see this one coming, but for some reason it's coming in hard. And south of where you are in the City of Angels, LA, one newsletter I really appreciate, and I was put onto it by a wonderful tech journalist called Sam Blake, is .LA. Now, I don't live in LA. I have no stake in what's happening in technology in LA, but I subscribe to it purely because of its layout, the use of the kind of digital highlighter pen and the clarity of how their snippets are presented. It's really interesting to learn about what's happening in my area of tech in one particular city. And I keep looking at it thinking, .LA, .New York, .London, .Edinburgh back home. That's a format that could really scale. So you take Substack, you take city-based activity, and you take beautiful UX and editorial design. And I think there's a winning formula that could crystallize into a startup that could go for many, many millions of dollars. Another point just to make is costs. My newsletter of choice is Benedict Evans' Sunday newsletter, a Bible for many people in Silicon Valley. I think he's getting close to the 200,000 subscriber mark. What's his overheads? One smartphone and one laptop, and that's it. And then
Crazy.
You compare that to trade publications where you have buildings, where you have unions, where you have health insurance. And as an economist, I kind of fall back on that point about the cost element of it, means to an end. He's inspiring close to 200,000 people every Sunday night, Monday morning with his newsletter at cost of a laptop and a phone versus somebody who's investing in buildings and everything else and perhaps only reaching 20,000 people. And that is Tarzan Economics. How long are you going to hold on to that old framework, that old cost structure as a means to an end before it lets go of you?
Oh, fascinating. I do want to ask you about a couple of just thoughts that you share in the book, and I'm not sure what they are and what they mean. So the first is Rockonomics. Let's jump into that for a second. I have no idea what you mean by that. I have not done my research on that particular idea. What is Rockonomics and how do I apply it, if I apply it?
Okay, so I'll deal with the copyright element first. Tarzan Economics is an expression that belongs to Jim Griffin, but I checked and the author of Tarzan died 70 years ago, so he's officially public domain. So I'm in the clear there. Rockonomics, I can't claim either. It was the title of a book by Alan Kruger, who a dear friend of mine and tragically took his life before his book saw the light of day. But prior to that, and as we go back maybe 10, 15 years, Mark Elliott had a book called Rockonomics, and I believe that's the first person to use that expression. That book, by the way, is fascinating. It's like a roller coaster ride through record label corruption. It tells you how the Beatles, what they used to do with the Beatles records in America was melt them in New York, repress them in Philadelphia, and that way they got around the doctrine of fair sale, so they didn't have to pay the band any money. Wow. That was then, this is now. But yeah, fascinating book. So Mark Elliott, Rockonomics, is the first time I've ever heard that expression being used. But if you go back to what I did, I had two passions when I was back home in Scotland, music on one side and economics on the other. So on the music side, I was writing for the magazine Straight No Chaser, which for UX designers, people may know the font specialist Swifty, who was very famous around that time as well, but a great magazine for design. That was Giles Peterson, Paul Bradshaw's publication. I was interviewing hip hop artists from Philadelphia and funk artists from Brazil. That was my forte from a bedroom in Edinburgh. And the day job was being a government economist and dealing with really tedious subjects like council tax reform. Frustration, why is there no economist working in the music business? Around that time, in the mid-noughties, business was falling off a cliff. There was piracy. The record label's response was to sue the consumer, sue the website, sue the ISP, litigation to fight change, to hold on to the old vine and fight change, as opposed to embrace it. And I just made it my wish, my determination to write my own job description. The last words of the book, not to offer a spoiler here, is don't wait for your job description, create your job description. It's the one lesson I give when I'm teaching high school kids, primary school kids, university students is do not look at the jobs board and see what's on offer. Look at what you've got and offer that instead. It's a better way to match up your talents. And I was very lucky that a chap called Adam Singer responded to my letter, which was completely out of the blue. I read an article by him in the Financial Times. I picked up the newspaper on a bus even. It gives me goosebumps saying this. Had I not sat on that bus, had I not sat in that seat, I would not have seen this paper and not be speaking to you now. Wrote to him. He came back to me within 48 hours, and he spent a day quizzing me on how you could use economics in music. He was like, how do we use your job description here? Quick example, he said, how would you price a music catalog? Stuck. I have no idea how to answer that question, but can I use economics to drum up an answer? And this is where Rockonomics comes to life. So I started thinking about examples such as how you might want to sell fish in Israel or flowers in Amsterdam, where you have a reverse auction. You start the clock at the top and you work down, and first in gets out with the product. Looking at second price sealed bid auctions, where you have an insurance mechanism to encourage people to join the bidding war. What drives up price is not bidding, it's the number of bidders. So you optimize the number of bidders and you get the highest price. So I started explaining how you could use auction design to selling a music catalog. And he said to me, you know what? In 75 years, I don't think we've ever thought about this in our business. I was like, aha, there may be a foot coming into the door here and it's not going to be allowed to get out again. And I credit Adam Singer. He took a gamble on me to become the first Rockonomist and spent the rest of the past 15 years trying to deal with inconvenient truths and avoiding getting fired, basically. But yeah.
Amazing. And I love the notion of just writing your own job description. It's so inspiring. And especially after the crazy year that we've all had, why not? Why not?
Well,
I love that idea.
You got to think as well in terms of what COVID and accelerated disruption is doing to education. I mean, it wouldn't be too misleading to say that next year's curriculum is already out of date. So I think a lot of people are making rational decisions here about, do I need to accumulate in Britain £10,000 worth of debt, in America perhaps that's £40,000 worth of debt, $40,000 worth of debt to get a degree and then have to learn it all again when I actually get into the job. And I think we are in for a bit of a rude awakening here. Again, another boy who's cried wolf is the MOOCs, the online education courses. But maybe, just maybe, because of COVID, that moment's about to come. So you're seeing Silicon Valley giants saying, don't go to university, just come to us and we'll train you instead. You know, that could be something that scales to the smaller companies too.
Absolutely. Okay, another thing I wanted to mention and ask you about is the notion of pivotal thinking. Before learning about you, I believe that the opposite of a good idea is a bad idea. but apparently you have what Wes Kao would call a spiky point of view, an interesting point of view, which says the opposite of a good idea can still be a good idea, and that is pivotal thinking. But you tell me, what's your definition and how can I apply it? And how is it possible that the opposite of a good idea can still be a good idea?
So I credit this with a wonderful fellow called Rory Sutherland from the Ogilvy Advertising Group. He would be a brilliant guest on your show. And when he speaks, I don't just listen, my brain is doing cartwheels. He's such an inspiration to me. And he came up with this expression of the opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea. There's more than just one good idea. And I remember when he said that, I was like, I wonder if I was ever to do this book where I could base a chapter around this. And the example I'll hook it around relates to somebody that very few of your viewers will have ever heard about. But in Britain, he's a bit of a kind of cult hero in politics. He's no longer with us, but it's Screaming Lord Sutch from the Monster Raving Loony Party. Okay, wait for it. So Screaming Lord Sutch was a rock star of some repute. I mean, he performed with Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. Alice Cooper basically stole his act and became a megastar of it. He has some credit as a rock star, but then he went into politics and campaigned for the Monster Raving Loony Party. I mean, this would be the perfect person to champion your website's cause, by the way, if he was still with us. But yeah, he has some great ideas. I mean, he had loony ideas that actually became law. He wanted to reduce the voting age. Seemed like a lunatic idea. Became law. We want to deregulate radio and allow commercial radio stations. Again, a lunatic idea. We only have the BBC in this country. It became law. Commercial radio licenses were granted. He also had some crazy ideas. He had an idea for a £20 note that if you drop it into a puddle, it wouldn't sink to the bottom. And that way you'd have your first ever floating currency. That's an economist joke. You may not care about that. Okay. But yeah, he's a very interesting character. But the one thing that he said that I loved, which was, how can you possibly only have one monopolies and mergers competition authority? So let's think of the FCC in America or the Competition and Markets Authority here. How can you only have one monopolies commission in a country? How can you monopolize the role of upholding competition? And I remember when he muttered those words, I was very young at the time, but I was like, wow, that's a point. How can you have a monopoly
Mind
grip
blown.
on what
Mind
competition
blown.
should look like? That's not fair. That's anti-competitive. You should be fined 10% of your turnover for doing just that. And that just really inspired me into his line of thinking. So what I did with a large part of that chapter of the book was to question how we regulate technology. The concept of monopoly, and I'll just wrap it up on this point here because we could go various directions here, but the concept of monopoly is to reduce output and jack up prices. Everybody gets that point. When you look at tech monopolies today, quite often what they're doing here is expanding output and reducing or even eliminating price. That does not mean they are good or bad. It means that that concept that you're using to attack or to praise them is no longer fit for purpose. So the opposite of a good idea, monopoly is bad, can also be a good idea, which is monopoly can also be good. You're just using the wrong framework to analyze them. So that's kind of where I take that role of pivotal thinking, is to really take a leaf out of the screaming Lord Such from the Monster Evening Looney Party. I really recommend to your readers that you that you check out some of his policies in the past. He's quite an incredible character.
Amazing. And I love how broad your inspirations are, it seems. It's a reminder to all of us. I always try to read and listen and consume outside of the main area, my main area of, UX research or psychology. By academic training, I'm a psychologist. Yeah. And I've always felt like that's a good idea. And I think everything you're sharing is just proof of the fact that inspiration can come from a variety of people in a variety of ways. So I absolutely love that.
You got to fight the echo chamber. I see it when I've watched you do past interviews. I can see that quality of your work, but it's just, going to a conference full of UX experts, what do you expect to learn? Real experts will never go to a conference full of UX experts.
Yeah. William, by the way, thank you, William, for joining us. He had a question about NPS, just going back to that for a second, talking about how managers advocate for NPS as a predictor of future sales based on just this need to forecast. So as an economist, have you found a way to satisfy this need without NPS, or maybe we should just downplay the need to forecast altogether?
Well, in terms of predicting future sales, I always look at the allocation of the marketing budget today. So we look at a record company, and let's say we're in a record label ourselves, and I'm the boss of the record company and I'm assessing your performance, and you say, hey, my album sold 2 million copies last week. Give me a bonus, give me a promotion. But you just backed the entire house of marketing budget to achieve those 2 million sales. Is that a relative performance? So that's simply to say the cost element is really acknowledged there. And then the other thing which I think is underneath that question is that eternal UX question of correlation and causation. In the book, I talk about another mentor of mine, Preston McAfee, talking about his time as chief economist of Microsoft. And he used to always ponder why the Microsoft computer always saw a spike in demand when they put it on sale at the same time as when schools and colleges went back. So what am I supposed to work out here? A, did it sell a lot because we had it as a sale discount? Or B, did it sell a lot because colleges and schools across America were going back into term time? Or C, why am I discounting a computer when demand is highest anyway? And it's another area of trying to assess future sales. It's just to take a look at the calendar, take a look at your discounting policy and ask, does this really add up? Because for a company the size of Microsoft, clearly it wasn't. So if a company that size can make a very simple mistake, then we're all susceptible.
Crazy. I have something I just have a self-interest in coming from your book, which is some new rules I hear for drawing a crowd, inspired by companies like Starbucks, the famous Tower Records. I remember the Tower Record stores in Israel growing up.
There was one there, yeah.
when that was still a thing, and Tupperware. I mean, I have so much to say just about Tupperware, but I want to first of all let you share what are some of these rules, because I certainly want to draw a crowd, and maybe others watching this are also interested. So, what are some of the ideas around that topic?
So I think the one big takeaway from that chapter is that consumers now are the new broadcasters. So from a top-down world where you had gatekeepers in charge of who got to see what, when there was only maybe 3 or 5 channels in your television set, and they dictated what would be on and when it would be scheduled, to this new bottom-up world where consumers are completely empowered with on-demand content at their own time, at their own discretion, an algorithm that specifically dictates content just for them. It's the consumer that's the new broadcaster, which means there's a lot of, again, if we look at fat that tech can trim, there's a lot of fat in the value chain now of judges who are no longer trusted. So there's a lot of gatekeepers out there kind of feeling like a turkey voting for Christmas. Like there's not much purpose for them because consumers making those shots. I mean, a very interesting example is if you look at quotas, cultural quotas around the world. The French were lobbying hard for French language quotas on Netflix during the early days of the company's launch there. Sorry, it's on-demand content. It doesn't work like the old model. You can't stare across the shoulder of a view of Netflix on the sofa and say, hey, put down those Pringles and click more French language content. We're watching you. It doesn't work. Go back, play a game of golf, get a job in a shoe shop. This is a wrong game for you. So I think there's a lot of rude awakenings when you start to think about the kind of the bottom-up consumer being the new broadcaster model. Tupperware of those 3 examples, perhaps the best one, which is a strange, bizarre story from 1948. Brownie Wise, a single mother, who went on to become, I think, one of the most famous, successful female business leaders in corporate America. But she saw how Tupperware was being marketed in the shops, and that would be billboards and above the line marketing. And this is 1948. This is just a couple of years after World War II is over. And this kind of top-down approach, let the judges tell you this product is good. And she realized, and this is perfect for your audience, she realized that people couldn't see the use cases. They couldn't envisage how they would use Tupperwares, how to turn those leftovers into makeovers. They couldn't see the way that you would seal the lid. And then she just went to door-to-door selling and then into Tupperware parties to allow consumers to use the product and to share uses they discover with the product, to find new applications the product could do. Like, oh, I have this situation in my family and we could use Tupperware for this. Wow, I didn't realize that. I will use it for my family too. She built a social network. Hello? She built a viral social network. Long before Hot or Not, long before Hotmail with try Hotmail free at the bottom, she built a social network that went viral. And those parties always had 15 people in them, those Tupperware parties, all predominantly housewives, would gather, and there would be 3 people who would succeed from the house party: the host, the seller, and the person who goes on to run the next Tupperware party. So the viral spread, the viral coefficient kicks into effect. But what I like, I mean, I'm just hop, skip, jumping over the story a little bit here for your viewers, but what I like about the Tupperware story was she realized in 1948 that top-down ain't going to work no more. We have to go bottom-up. I think what you're seeing now in many of the new media formats, it's not top-down coverage which drives demand. It's bottom-up. It's consumers opting in. You just think, maybe wrap up on this point, you think about Facebook's newsfeed. What's that? 1.6 billion people get that every morning. Not one of those news feeds is the same. So the one-to-many model of, I'm a radio DJ and I believe everyone should love this song, so I'm going to play this song so you all have to love it. Toast. The many one-to-one network, the new reality.
What a time to be alive. Will, I could talk to you for hours, but we are already kind of past where we planned to be, sadly. And so I'll maybe just end with this question. I'm just so curious to hear, going back to the music industry, which has been such a big part of your life, where do you think the next kind of branch is, or the next, it's funny, I hate to ask people to prophesize, to think about the future. Who knows? And it just doesn't always make sense to do it. And yes, I can never hold myself back from asking people, where do you think the music industry is going, and what's the next kind of branch we have to hold on to, or things might, not work out very, very well? I'm just so curious to hear your take on the industry as a whole, and just thinking of Spotify in particular. The entrance into podcasting is obviously of incredible interest to me. I love podcasts. I love podcasting as a creator. I'm curious if you've had any thoughts on where the industry goes next.
Okay, so I think there's one music-specific question that's very pertinent at the moment, which I think many other professions will be able to draw from. And we go back to that observation of COVID has accelerated change that was already in place.
Absolutely.
So the next question is, how much of that change sticks once we get back to normal? Okay, so the high street was already in trouble pre-COVID. It's in real trouble post-COVID. Can it work out a way to recover? Now, we think about Tarzan Economics of holding onto the old vine, in dire hope that it's going to keep you off the jungle floor, and reluctant to grab the new vine through a fear of the unknown. And we look at the live music industry. What we've seen in music as an early adopter of disruptive change, perhaps more so than any other profession, it got there first, is once again, we've been adopting live streaming in a way that you wouldn't believe. And credit to companies like Twitch, which have just seen an explosion in live streaming music success stories happen during lockdown. This is quite a deep topic here, but when you suppress music, what happens through suppression is quite enlightening. If you look at the history of jazz in 1877 in New Orleans, jazz happened through suppression of Creoles in New Orleans society. So again, you've seen musicians get suppressed and then fight for survival through live streaming. So, Twitch would be one. If you look at the Billie Eilish live stream event, or Dua Lipa, who claims 5 million viewers to her live stream, you've seen amazing progress in live streaming happen. Now, the question that you've got to ask, the transferable question for your viewers to ponder here, is live streaming ain't going away when live music returns. So how do these two things coexist? You just pause it there and think about how that could apply to many other industries as we come out of COVID. Coexistence is going to be the challenge. And I think that's going to be the interesting one for us to watch. Are we going to see live streaming be embedded into the live performance? So millions of people get to watch the band backstage before they come out of the curtain, but only 50,000 get to see them on stage when they play to a muddy field at a festival. Inside that is another debate, which is monetization, which is, can we create fan clubs through live streaming? Can artists actually monetize directly with fans? Music streaming was launched in 2002 with the launch of Rhapsody, interestingly. And three things haven't changed since 2002. Essentially have stayed the same. Firstly, Rhapsody launched at $9.99 as a price point. It's still $9.99, 19 years on from that date. Secondly, it's impossible on a conventional streaming platform to communicate with your favorite band. You can do on SoundCloud and YouTube and Twitch, but you can't on Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify. And thirdly, you can't compensate them directly either. So we're 19 years into this journey, and it's still the same price point. You still can't communicate, and you still can't compensate. And if I look at the progress that live streaming's made in this period, that TikTok is making in this period, I think once again, music matters because it got there first. And you're going to see a huge disruption in the creator economy. Mark Geiger has made some interesting kind of post-Spotify era comments here about the world we're moving into, which is, let's solve those issues. Let's take the ceiling off price. Let's allow for direct social engagement. Let's enable direct compensation. And I think that's what's going to happen in music first. And as with so many other examples of the disruption, you're going to start to see it roll out into many other professions second.
Amazing. All right, Will, let's end there. I want to thank you so much. This was fascinating for me. Some of the conversation is kind of foreign as a non-economist, but it's just so nice to learn from someone from another field. And to all of you watching, we talked about this. It's such a privilege to learn from those other fields, from other people. I cannot stress this enough. You should go on Amazon or whatever your favorite online bookstore is and order this book, order Tarzan Economics. It sounds fascinating. The idea is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts from the book. I really appreciate your time. And I've pre-ordered my copy, by the way. So I cannot wait to just learn a lot more about these topics. Anything else from you, Will, before we finish? Any final thoughts?
I'd only wish and hope and trust that you're going to go out to your viewers straight afterwards and issue an NPS survey and find out what they thought.
We'll see about that.
But no, seriously, your NPS work, I mean, we need to put wind in the sail of that one. It'd be an amazing achievement if this could go viral, if the consumer could become the new broadcaster and you could actually make a real difference here. I just can't imagine how many false signals are happening in corporate America because of so much belief in that NPS score.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to figure out, and I hope to help with, is first of all doing more in-depth research on the faults of metrics like NPS and showcasing that better. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is developing better alternatives and building that out. And we're not quite there yet, but thank you. And again, if you want to support the movement against poor metrics, please check out npsistheworst.com. Order yourself a t-shirt or a mug or socks or maybe toilet paper. You never. I'll do my best. We'll see what happens. That could be
the one that goes viral. I mean, there'll be a lot of repeat usage, right?
Exactly. And for everyone who was watching, thank you so much as always for being in the audience. And we will see you again soon. Cheers, Will. Have a good afternoon.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.